We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
What are the pitfalls, paradoxes, possibilities, risks, benefits of engaging in diversity and equity work as a white man? And what support do men need to engage meaningfully in this work? Dan Mahle is a man I've been following in the Mankind Project for about a decade. He's always stood out to me because of his integrity in his leadership, his truth-telling, and his compassion with Wholeheartedness, which is also his website. We sat down to talk about his work with organizations and teams on building equitable culture, especially working with white men. And it starts with knowing who we are, cultivating our innate sense of value and significance. It's about letting go of orthodoxy and fear of messing up, knowing that we will have an impact, leaning in any way. We talk about building bridges where men can and do step fully into healthy power and agency, and at the same time recognize and unmask the big systems and structures that we are a part of to work to uplift everyone. In his words, into the enlivening possibility of change. And we talk about what it looks like to lean into the resistance that many of us as white guys have around this work. Like, do I feel like I'm walking on eggshells around this conversation, afraid of messing up, afraid of not being perfect? Dan has some incredible insights around how to move beyond this old frame, past perfectionism and shame, into empowerment and opportunity. How to literally get into our bodies and into our relationships in a way that builds us up and changes what it feels like to be in community with all kinds of people. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. Hey everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson with the Mankind Podcast, the podcast where we are setting out to prove that there is indeed more than one way to be a man, and I think we're doing a pretty fine job proving that. Today, I get to hang out with somebody who I've never met in person, who I have been admiring from afar for years, and the work that he has been doing. I'm with Dan Mahle today. Dan Mahle is the founder of the Wholehearted Masculine, which is primarily how I've been tracking him and seeing his development. And he's also a new warrior, a graduate of the New Warrior Training Adventure, connected to Mankind Project. So we've had that in common over years. We've connected on that. He's a professional coach, a group facilitator. He's a coach consulting with organizations, especially about, we're going to be talking about equity work. We're going to be talking about race and working with white men and working with organizations. He supports male leaders to connect to their authentic power in accountable ways by unlocking and expressing vital parts of themselves that are often undervalued in hypermasculine business cultures. We'll probably have to define that. So his work with leaders is rooted in a decade of coaching, leading men's work, and facilitating transformational learning experiences. His passion is exploring the power of wholeheartedness to disrupt oppression and reconnect us to all of our shared humanity. He's in Boulder, Colorado. He's a married guy. He has a young daughter. And we were just talking about Rumi, his puppy. So, Dan, thank you for being here. Say hello.
Thanks for having me, Boysen. Good to be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation, and you and I have been swinging, and I'll take full responsibility for swinging and missing in terms of setting up calendar stuff. But I'm really glad that we get back into the room today, and directly following into kind of where you came from. Well, first of all, do you share your age? How old are you? You're a younger guy.
It depends how you define younger these days, but I'm 37, so pushing 40.
Yes. Okay. One of the things that I've admired about Dan is like, and you've been around MKP work for a decade, maybe?
Almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
2013.
Almost a decade. So I saw this, from my perspective, very young guy coming in, huge hearted, powerful leadership, kind of making some waves in the work and conducting stuff. So I've just been, I'm a fan. I've been an admirer. What inspired you to get into the work that you're doing, dedicating yourself, especially to working with white men on these issues, these really difficult, complicated issues of race, power, justice, privilege, all of that stuff?
Yeah. So, there's kind of two main parts. The first is around the time that I went to college, and shortly thereafter, I had some friends who really engaged me deeply in anti-racism, anti-sexism work. And I had a lot of resistance, a lot of questions. I pushed back a lot. I didn't really get it yet. And I think part of it was I wasn't ready. And I was on my own journey around it. But it was a few years after that when I got involved with MKP and did the New Warrior Weekend. And that connected me to a vital part in myself that had been forgotten and abandoned. And that's I would say, for lack of a better term, the masculine energy, the wild man energy in me, which really felt like the missing ingredient in claiming my authentic power and place in the world. And as I started to come into contact with that part that had been missing and that power that had been dormant, I felt more resourced to engage in the work around anti-racism and sexism, because I knew who I was. I felt a comfort in my skin that I hadn't felt before. And in that space, I was willing to engage in the discomfort and the vulnerability in a way that I just didn't have the capacity to do before. And so it's really just been in the past couple of years that my work has centered around engaging white men as partners in equity work. But it's been almost a decade, as we talked about, of the men's work journey and working with men generally. So that's a bit of the story.
That brought up several distinctions that I want to dig into a little bit. So the first one is getting in touch with your authentic power. What's the alternative?
Well, I think, it's not too hard to recognize that in many of our institutions today, including the world of business, that there is this sort of hyper-masculine culture. That's the undertone of what's happening in the space, in the environment. And the way I think about that is it's connected in the domination paradigm. So this idea that we're in competition for scarce resources. It's a zero-sum game. Your win is my loss, vice versa. And I have to outcompete and climb the ladder faster in order to win the game. And that model, I believe, is very incomplete and doesn't allow for the wholeness of our humanity or our longings or dreams or visions or any of that to really be included. And so what I'm inviting is for us to think about masculinity differently and think about power differently. So rather than wielding power over others in order to feel a sense of my self-worth, I start by cultivating an innate sense of significance. And then I cultivate power with others. And so that's what I mean when I think about authentic power, is that it's not a power contingent on some outside validation or some comparing with others, but it's a power that's intrinsic to who I am, that I have a place here just for who I am, and everything else is icing on the cake.
Intrinsic value. That was really well said. And I also noticed that you use the word incomplete when talking about that kind of look at. So you didn't say broken, bad, horrible, all of those kinds of words. I guess that leads me into a question. So what do you see as kind of damaging or harmful in some of the ways that this equity work has been expressed in the last decade? Like, you and I had a pre-conversation. We hit on one of the people who we like have been taking messages from for a while now. How is the equity work harmful, especially to white guys, to cisgendered, hetero, college-educated, able-bodied white guys sitting in a room together?
That's an interesting question. And I will say, I'm just going to start with my own personal experience, because as I mentioned earlier, I was resistant coming into this work. And I think what happens for me, especially when there's another white guy who's like, let me teach you about racism and like help you figure out DEI. I'm just like, back off, bro. Like, I don't need you to help me. Like, there's this resistance that comes up because, first of all, I don't think I should be learning from another white guy. Like, what do you know? And second of all, I feel like a lot of competition with that person. Do you think you're better than me? Do you think you know more? Are you trying to position yourself in a way that's like elitist and you sort of looking down on me?
Another kind of power
all of this
game.
came up. Yeah, exactly. It's like, because I was viewing it through that same domination lens of, who's better, who's more woke, who's this or that. It was always this zero-sum game of importance and significance and value. And it's taken a lot of work to get to the point where I could actually seek out other white men to learn from and recognize we have a unique opportunity to support one another on our equity journey, and that it's really important work that we do that, not just for others, but for all of us, and the way that we rehumanize ourselves. Now, I will say there is I think what is a fair critique that equity work can sometimes be sort of an orthodoxy, that there's a right way to do things and a wrong way, and that there's a lot of fear that gets created around showing up in ways that are triggering or cause harm to other groups. And I find myself, earlier on in this work, I found myself giving away my power and being really deferential in all equity spaces, because I just wanted to become as invisible as possible so that I wouldn't be blamed or singled out for causing harm. But what I've realized, and Martin Luther King Jr. has a quote around this, silence is also a form of violence. If we are passive bystanders in inequity and injustice, that is actually contributing to the harm. And so I realized that I need to take the risk of engaging creatively, taking action, being imperfect, but still showing up, rather than presuming that by my non-action, I would avoid causing harm.
Mm-hmm. There's a discomfort is a word that you've used, and a word that came up for me also is kind of like impact, right? In equity work, we talk about intent and impact, and I've been there too. I just don't want to make any impact on anybody, right? Which is a very disempowered place to be. And I also notice in me, like, that contributes to that sense of defensiveness, to that sense of fragility. I'm going to call it fragility, right? Reactivity, right? Because if I'm trying not to make an impact on anything all the time, and then I have an impact and there's like some little explosions going off of resentment. Yeah. One of the ways that I've been thinking about that is like, isn't the point to impact each other?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we are here as human beings to be in relationship with one another, with ourselves, with the world. And when I try to be as small or invisible as I possibly can be, I'm not in relationship anymore. That's just a way of hiding and running away from my power, from the people I love, from the discomfort that might be there for me, right, to face. And so rather than shying away from that discomfort, I've been cultivating a support system relationships, friends, family, awareness, emotional agility, men's work, a support system to enable me to engage in a sustained way, to not become too overwhelmed. And I will say, I've had plenty of moments where I get called out, get called in, recognize some harm that I've created, and I get, I get scared, I get angry, I get defensive, I get prickly. These are all natural responses. It's not about somehow transcending our emotional experiences. It's quite the opposite. It's how do we be in the emotion, in the moment, and still have a skillful response and be able to actually notice for ourselves, here's what I'm feeling right now. Wow, I'm defensive, I'm angry. And then be able to breathe and work with that and show up in a way that is respectful and honoring of those around us and of ourselves.
That was extraordinarily well said. Yeah, the point of the fragility is not to eliminate it. The point of it is to learn to integrate it in an effective way in the moment, right?
Well, Boyson, I appreciate that you use the term fragile, and at the same time, I don't use that word, and I want to explain why.
Please, good.
I think, first of all, you call men fragile. You've just poked at the wound of toxic masculinity, the traditional masculine idea that we can't show weakness. And so to be called essentially fragile or weak is a non-starter. And so I'm not saying that a lack of emotional resiliency may be present. I think sometimes it is. It certainly has been for me. But I don't want to be called fragile. I think what's more effective and useful is to say that I need more support, or I need more... I need to build more skillfulness, or I need to cultivate more emotional resiliency or agility. And I like that language because it's an accessible bridge in for guys who are like, yeah, I care about this work, but I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. I'll keep making mistakes.
Good.
Because like you said, I'm going to impact the world. I'm not just going to shy away and run away. But, right now we have this culture where it's like, for guys, if you want to stand in your power in the way that masculinity teaches us about power, asserting ourselves, right? The only options available are to sort of move away from the equity work and say, at the extreme, you could say, join the Proud Boys or something. But even in the more nuanced forms, it's not an active engagement in DEI or in equity work, because that's where it's often seen as like a threat to that power. That we have to give something up, we have to risk, we have to lose something, status, belonging, whatever it might be. Risk cancellation for making the mistakes, making a mistake that ultimately could cost us our job or our reputation. These are very real fears. And I want to acknowledge the importance of that and say we need to do better. Those of us who are practitioners and leaders in the equity work and in who are more on the progressive side of politics, we need to do much better at building bridges for men to step into authentic forms of power in the equity work that we care about, to build a world where we can all thrive. And that's really the heart of where I focus, because I focus at the intersection of men's work and equity work. And so by doing that, my goal is to bring all of the grounded power and relationships and trust and vulnerability that men's work offers and take it to the next level. So we're not just addressing the symptoms, but we're also addressing the systems. And so we can bring all that beautiful space holding capacity into the inevitable discomfort of engaging in our equity work together. And by doing that, there are so many ways that we can benefit individually and collectively through our engagement.
Thank you. There are, as you were beginning in that, you were pointing out some of the threats to traditional ways of being masculine, the ways that we were taught, the ways that we're supposed to be powerful. And I just want to call out, like, some of those things are real, like threat to reputation, threat to perceived power in an environment, threat to hierarchy, threat to those kinds of things, right? And I think that in a conversation that I had recently being interviewed by someone else asking me about these things, there was like, it's sometimes it's people of color, LGBTQ people that I'm afraid of, or people who are in less positions of traditional power, but who I'm really afraid of is other white guys.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's an important observation, because it goes back to that idea of us being in this fundamental competition, this zero-sum game of self-worth. And that's the myth. That's the myth that's at the foundation of this insecure power that we have cultivated, because that's just what we were taught power looked like. And what I'm inviting, and what I think many folks in equity work are inviting, is a deeper power. It's a power rooted in our essential humanity, a power that doesn't sway in the winds of other people's projections, insecurities, judgments, but is grounded in a fundamental sense of who we are, and that is enlivened rather than threatened by change, by the evolution of our sense of ourself and our sense of the world, and by the transformation of our own narrative and story. Like, that's not a threat in this worldview. It's enlivening, because we know that we are on a lifelong learning journey. And so every opportunity to challenge our assumptions, to question our beliefs, is a cherished opportunity rather than a threat to our very existence.
Thank you. What does that look like? So in the work that you're doing, what does it look like when an organization or individuals in an organization start to move from that kind of threatened zero sum to an enlivening possibility of change?
So last year I was invited in to do some coaching and consulting work with a consulting firm, about 120 employees, and about 20 of those were white men. So it's actually a smaller proportion than might typically be the case in most organizations. But there was a BIPOC woman who invited me in to work with the white men in that organization. She said they tried other facilitators and they hadn't been able to make movement, and there was a lot of resistance. And so I was brought in specifically because I identify as a cis hetero white male, and because of my men's work background. And what we did looked a little bit like a men's group at first. And by that, I mean, we gathered, it was about 8 or 9 of us on a Zoom call. We gathered twice a month for 90 minutes. And in the first meeting, all we did was share stories. We just talked about our lives. We talked about what it was like to be a white male engaging in this work, being called into this work. And we got to know each other. And over the first few months, we really built some trust and some psychological safety, which is really just the capacity to be vulnerable without fear of repercussion, without fear of being maligned or kind of thrown out for our vulnerability. And the trust very quickly turned into, I think, a genuine love and care. And that's what I experience in men's groups that I lead and that I've been a part of. But it's not something that I had thought would be so easily replicated in organizational systems. And I was really pleasantly surprised. I was really heartened by how quickly and how deeply the group was ready to give up a lot of those ideas of being in competition with each other and being stuck in sort of the rut of domination culture. And we started practicing building a new culture together. And it was not one that was meant to replace the culture that we lived the rest of our lives in, but one that was meant to exist within it, so that there's the opportunity to learn from this emerging culture, even as we don't abandon the one that we live in. And in those spaces, men said that they felt a sense of connectedness and brotherhood and safety and trust that allowed them to go deep around this work in ways that before had felt totally off limits. Before, they felt like they were walking on eggshells. You hear that a lot.
Good.
Leaders saying, I just feel like I have to tiptoe around this work. I'm going to make a mistake. Yep. Somebody's going to get activated or triggered, and it's super annoying. And it's like, well, guess what? This work is rooted in relationships. If you don't have the relationships, you'll be walking on eggshells. If you do have the relationships, if you are cultivating those relationships across difference in your organization, then the eggshells melt away. And what takes its place is a sense that our humanity is front and center, along with the humanity of everyone else around us. And being human is not a perfect game. Perfectionism is actually part of the harm of domination culture, that we have to all be perfect and kind of never make a mistake. It's about how do we respond when mistakes happen. And that's where accountability and responsibility are such important building blocks. And we started making major progress around all of that from the simple foundation of building trust through vulnerability in an all white male space.
Excellent. Beautiful. And I think that, again, we can circle back around to what I hear from other white guys about equity work out there is not just that. I don't want to feel like I have to be walking on eggshells all the time. I don't want to get canceled. I'm like all of that kind of stuff. And that what I notice in some of my super left colleagues is that there is a reassertion of this kind of perfectionism of space, right? There's like, we have to make it perfect. We have to, we're calling each other out constantly on foibles and And there's kind of a new kind of domination hierarchy that can also feel very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Is that something you witness also?
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking to that. I think it is something that I've witnessed. And at first, something that I felt myself enacting, because I felt like, oh, well, the way to make things right, since I've been part of this group that's caused so much harm, the way to make things right is not only to disappear, but also to devalue myself and others like me. And that is what backfires. There's no faster way to push people away from your cause than to basically say, you're the problem. And so I've had to do a lot of work to get to the point where I truly believe I'm not the problem. I sometimes do problematic things, and I take responsibility and I'm accountable for those actions, but I am not the problem. And I believe that's true of white men in general. We are not the problem. We have a huge opportunity to be a leverage point for change. And the opportunity presents itself when we recognize we have a role to play, and it's a unique role, but it's a role, and it's a very needed role. And I think on the far left, sometimes like you said, there can be this sort of, as a friend of mine calls it, the woke Olympian energy, where it's like, who can outperform, everybody else in wokeness. And I think in a way that's what's helped to fuel this sort of anti-woke culture on the right, which of course is a distortion of a lot of the rhetoric on the left. But it's a very intentional and fabricated distortion of it. But still, it feels to those of many of us more in the center as valid because of the intensity of that sort of performative or intense competitive equity stance. And what I'm here to say is, like, I am not better than any other white man. I am not further along than any other white man. I'm on my journey. You're on your journey. let's talk about it.
If you're enjoying the Mankind podcast, how about checking out an online men's group? Imagine a brotherhood where men really listen and support each other to be the best of who they are. It's free, confidential, and facilitated. Groups are available multiple times every week. Find out more in the show notes.
Very well said. Can we address the word woke? Is that something that you've done any research into? This is totally off script from where we were going to go, but I've got some etymological and cultural insights around the word woke that, woo.
I have a perspective around it, but actually I'd love to hear you start with your etymology, if you don't mind.
So just cultural, where it came from, right? Where did that start showing up? And that started showing up in the 1930s, 1940s, around jazz culture. And stay woke was something that people of color would say to other people of color about the risks and dangers of white people encroaching on space, especially cops.
Wow.
Stay woke. Be aware that there may be danger present. Right? Yep. And then later, again, through kind of subculture and pop culture, black culture, wokeness became a sign of recognition by people of color of other folks, white folks or other people who were operating in the world with some level of awareness about the danger for people of color from other white people. So then if a person of color says, well, he's woke, then it's kind of a recognition that this person has an awareness of what's going on. And now, as you just said, you know, in the common vernacular now, as it's being used, it's become an absolutely derogatory thing, right? And I hear that all the time, like such and such has gone woke, such and such company, Cracker Barrel, got called out as going woke for having Impossible sausage offered at their stores now, right?
Wow.
So just there's a little bit of historical that frames it, and like what's the and the question is, what's the alternative? Asleep.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you bringing in the etymology and the history of that word, and also reminding me and us that this is a word used in the Black community. It's not a word that was designed to be taken and repurposed. And I just want to acknowledge how often that happens, you know, in white culture, white supremacist culture. And the interesting thing here also is that, you know, there is this general invisibility of the experiences of people of color that white culture perpetuates. So we just don't see it. We don't see the risks. We don't see the lived experiences because we don't have to. And it's not because we're bad people. It's just that the system of white supremacy, the system, right? Not individuals, not bad actors, but the system of white supremacy that underpins all of this, that actually creates sort of its own disguise, its own cover, so that we don't see it for what it is. And we don't see it the way that other groups experience it every single day. So that feels like a really important prerequisite to this conversation, because when we start to recognize how little we see,
yes,
then we can recognize the importance of the original intention behind the word woke and why it was so necessary to have language to discern between, let's say, white folks who to some degree are doing their work and leaning in to understand those other experiences versus white people who are not.
That was very well said. And it brought me to one of the questions that I had thrown in our document about not seeing ignorance in its purest word. I don't know. Right. Yeah. What was your experience growing up? Like, I don't know where you grew up. When did you start waking up to the lived experience of others in this way?
Well, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, a couple thousand people, and actually a pretty diverse place, relatively speaking, for the heart of the Midwest. And then moved to Boulder, Colorado when I was 12 and entered into a world where 92% of the population is white, which felt like a pretty big culture shock, and also an economic culture shock in terms of affluence in this area. And so my own journey, it really wasn't until college when I started looking more deeply at this stuff. And as I said, I had a lot of resistance. I felt like this wasn't about me. There was no role for me in it. Why should I care? There was even a point, maybe more like 5 years ago, where I thought to myself, it's so annoying that everybody's just talking about equity all the time. Like, aren't there other lenses to view the world through? And yeah, sure there are. But there's something that I found I was missing. I felt so defensive against being told that there's stuff I'm not seeing, that there are parts of my identity that I'm not even aware of. And I now come to see that and call that the white male lens. Like, there's literally putting on glasses and seeing the world in a certain way and taking those glasses off and looking at them and saying, oh, there's actually a different lens that I have than folks from other groups have. And don't get me wrong, there is a multiplicity of diversity amongst white men. We are all so different.
Beautiful.
And I'm not trying to create a monolith here, because that doesn't exist. But what I will say is that when we talk about the white male lens, there are some overlapping features of that perspective that do often transcend all of our incredible differences as well. And so that can be a powerful starting point for recognizing the way we move through the world and what we can and cannot see in our position as a white man. And I feel like that's really powerful, because that helps me see that, well, everybody else has a lens too. What's their lens? And to get curious about and start, being interested in the perspectives that are very different from my own. And that's the starting point to really being able to decenter white culture and have a conversation about how we all show up together.
Nice. Thank you. Well said. Yeah, there's what's invisible to me, what has been invisible to me in the way that I grew up, in the way that I was raised, and what the culture kind of shows me, just what I see on a daily basis, right? So much invisible. And very important, what you said, is that it's not monolithic.
Yes.
Right. And so I can harm people, harm my relationships, harm my interactions by making assumptions that things are monolithic, by projecting, all my invisible stuff onto other white guys around me, right? Without knowing their history, without diving into the narrative of where they came from. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true. Boysen, but I also want to add one more piece here, which is, I think it's pretty confronting for a lot of us as white guys to be told that we have a group identity. I think, we're told we're rugged individuals, right? I'm Dan. I'm not a white man. I don't want to identify with all those labels and all the baggage that comes with it. I don't want to be seen as the problem or the oppressor, And yet, so long as I stick with only my individual identity and I don't lean into this group identity, I'm missing a whole part of what's going on. And so I think it's really important for us to explore our group identity, but it's not an either or. I still get to be Dan. We still get to be individuals with lots of differences, who bring our diversity to the table amongst white men, right? And can we begin to have the courage to look at the ways that we have a group membership, and that group wields a certain kind of power and position in our institutions and in our society, and that we can responsibly steward the power that we have or we can sort of allow ourselves to look the other way and let things continue, in an unjust, unequal way.
Really well said. Thank you. And I think that there's what's it take to get there? What's it take to get there to be able to recognize how I can see that group identity as a thing, as an object that I can look at and kind of, yeah. And I think it takes a lot of slowing down, right? It takes the emotional resiliency that you were talking about to be able to be in a space, be in some kind of culture and get enough light between me and the culture that I can actually start to draw some of those distinctions, right? It's like, oh, wow, I didn't recognize that we were all kind of thinking that way.
Right. Yeah. Bresma Minicum has a great book called My Grandmother's Hands, and he talks about embodiment and about the nervous system. And I think the work has to be grounded there, because essentially if we start by getting present with our emotions, breathing, being grounded in our bodies, just like in men's work we do often to kick off our circles, we bring a nervous system that's actually ready to engage in the work. Whereas if we don't do that work and we come in frazzled, or we come in panicked or manic or whatever, then that energy tends to completely undermine our good intentions and really muddies the water of the impact we hope to make in this work. And so that is a building block, and it's so critical to start with the body, start with the emotions, start with the breath, and return frequently to that place. But I'm also thinking about a few other authors that have been really impactful for me. Good. One is Heather McKee, who writes a book called The Sum of Us, where she talks about the zero-sum game fantasy and the way that myth really impacts how we show up politically, socially, relationally, in building a more equitable world, or in this case, often blocking what would help us on the path of a more equitable society. And I think that's a really important component too, is just to start looking at our own conditioning and say, wow, I'm conditioned to believe that I'm in competition all the time and that their win is my loss and vice versa, and I got to get mine. And to look at the ways that the relationships needed for this work actually rest in the principle of collaboration. It doesn't mean we never compete. Competing can be a really beautiful thing, but if we're competing because our sense of self-worth, identity, and significance depends on it, that's a high stakes game I don't want to play. If we're competing from a sense of fundamental worth, that's beautiful. It's fun. It's enlivening, right? And so it's all about how we bring these qualities into the world, not whether they should or shouldn't exist. And so that's sort of why we start with the body, the breath, and the awareness that we hold, that then leads to how we show up in the world.
Fundamental self-worth as a foundational. Fundamental self-worth as foundational, which kind of runs in the face of the projections that a lot of equity work gets, right? Which is, you're supposed to feel like a piece of shit about who you are because of your group identities.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there was a study recently, organizational study, that looked at, a couple thousand white men in positions of leadership, and just asked the question around, do they feel engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion work? Why or why not? And what they found is about 70% of white men feel disengaged, and feel, actually the word they use is they feel forgotten by DEI. And I thought that was really interesting, because there's so many reasons that could be behind that feeling or that experience. One is what you just mentioned, feeling vilified, or that you're the problem, or you don't have a place in the conversation, or you shouldn't have a place in the conversation. But I think the opportunity here is for us as white men to actually take some more initiative, not just sit back and wait for people to give us permission to engage in the work, but start doing our own research, start learning, start engaging, asking questions, being interested in those who we feel have more experience than we do, and learning from them, and being willing to make mistakes and be accountable. But I think, when I hear the term "we've been forgotten," it just makes me feel like it's a powerlessness, right? Like somehow I needed somebody to remember me rather than I could just remember myself. And look, I get that the feeling of being forgotten or being left out can come up, but I say we do the work to engage proactively, to involve ourselves in ways that are accountable, especially to BIPOC leaders in this work or in our organizations, but to step up. That's really what it comes down to, is like, how are we stepping up? And oftentimes that really just starts with curiosity, expressing interest, and a willingness to be in the discomfort of not knowing your place, not knowing how to do it right, not knowing how to avoid messing up, but still showing up. And I think that's the power that we can bring when we're really in our authentic leadership as men.
Thank you. There was something about a replacement of many of us get status granted, systemic status, right? I get status based on X, Y, and Z factors, some of them being identity factors, right? And it's replacing those status conveyed by system into status arising from self.
Yes, exactly. That's beautifully put. And that's where men's work is front and center, because what men's work does so well, in my experience, is to cultivate a sense of personal value and relational belonging. And when we have those two ingredients and we're cultivating them consistently with a group of men, that's when we have the support system and the foundation needed to engage in the systems, to engage at that level, right? And I see again and again men who don't have that foundation, who don't have the connection to men's work, who are engaging in equity work and are doing so from a fundamental place of lack, that there's a problem that they're trying to solve because they're not okay. There's a group I heard about called the men's wrongs movement. And to go against the men's rights movement. And I'm just thinking, okay, we don't need either extreme here. We need, how about the men's accountability movement or the men's authenticity movement, right? This is what I'm interested in, because you probably noticed in a lot of my language, I'm trying not to speak in dualistic and binary terms that pit one against another, because I really see we need all of it. My interest is wholeheartedness and wholeness. And that means embracing the parts of us that are hardest to love. And it also means cultivating the parts of us that, are most needed. And to me, that's the most important foundation of the work, is really connecting to our own value and our innate sense of belonging in community.
You mean to tell me that it's not just a switch that's going to get flipped off and we're going to be all done with this stuff? Is that what you're trying to tell me here?
Oh man, there's some days when I wish it was just a checklist, or a switch. If we just focus on this work for the next year, then we're smooth sailing from there on. We've got it all done. And it's like, nope, this is lifelong, and probably multiple lives, if you believe in that, because the work continues indefinitely. But the beauty of this is, if we think about this work, like I said before, as a lifelong learning journey, as an invitation into our deepest sense of self, our authenticity, the fullness of who we are, the corners in us that are most shadowy and cobwebby. If we look at it as an adventure, a challenge, an opportunity, then it doesn't have to feel like hard work. It doesn't have to feel like a burden. It doesn't have to feel like a problem that we need to solve with a hammer, because we can't, And the opportunity then is to lean into a way of being that fundamentally orients around this work as an important part of our learning journey and an important part of our humanity. And that through engaging in equity work, we become more fully who we are in the world. We become brighter and more wholehearted in our relationships. We become more capable of building inclusive cultures and environments where all people can thrive. We see ourselves from a different perspective that allows us to be more aware, more reflective, and to grow in a much more powerful and consistent way in our lives and in our leadership. What could be more exciting than that? Sign me up for that adventure.
Well said. And there is a fundamental realignment of kind of our nervous system and feedback mechanisms. And I'm thinking about dopamine stuff, right? It's like defeating Thanos. Yes, we've done it. We won, right? Yeah. There's a we oneness about that, and engaging in it as a journey. I have to realign my understandings and realign my system. So it's not the defeating Thanos. It's what happened today.
That's right. Yeah.
It's the small victory. It's the open. It's whoa, I got to be completely open-hearted in a relational conversation for 10 minutes today. My whole nervous system can respond to that. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. I've heard it said that, the patriarchy can be a death by 1,000 cuts, cutting us down, keeping us limited in what Tony Porter calls the man box culture, right? And in the same sense, liberating masculinity, what I call wholehearted masculinity, is about building ourselves up with 1,000 moments of vulnerability and healing and connection. And that is the work that we get to do. And I don't know if I can swear on here, but it's effing beautiful.
You can absolutely fucking swear on here. Yes, we do that. Yeah, nice. So you mentioned a couple of books. You mentioned Heather McKee. We've mentioned Resmaa Menakem. Anybody else that you want to just say, hey, if this is appealing to you, if you're turned on by this, here are a couple more books to grab.
Yeah, absolutely. One book that's really inspired me is Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment by Leticia Nieto. And it really looks at human consciousness and has a developmental lens of engaging in this work, the work of equity and collective liberation. So I find that one particularly useful. And then, Ta-Nehisi Coates has some really beautiful articles and books that, to me, his poetry, his poetic way of writing draws me at a more heart-centered level than some other work, which is more intellectual. And so I always encourage people to read some of his work just to get the visceral elements of racism, right? I will also name Bell Hooks as a key influence for me. Bell Hooks writes a book called The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, which I think you're reaching for right now. Yeah, there it is. That book is one of the, handful of books that guides my work. And she's a major influence. And I highly encourage folks to read that. It's, it's looking at men engaging in feminism, and it looks at it in a way that is intersectional, that is deep, that is non-judgmental and deeply loving. And I think that's very, very important when we're having these conversations, because so often what gets triggered for me, and I think for other white men at times, is this feeling of I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, I'm being told I need to just leave because I don't deserve to be here. And so we need a lot of reassurance, we need a lot of reassurance from ourselves, from each other, that it's okay to be doing this work, to be messing up, to be learning, to be engaging imperfectly, and that it's not our worthiness of love or our sense of belonging that needs to be endangered. It's actually just the sense of needing to be perfect or needing to have it all figured out or have all the answers or not need help. That's what's getting challenged. And so when I started to realize that I'm not fundamentally being told that something about me is wrong, I'm just being told that there's learning I need to do to better understand how I move through the world and the impacts I have on those around me, and that will help me understand myself better. So that is sort of an ethos, a philosophy that I think Bell Hooks really does a great job of speaking to. And actually all of these authors do a good job of holding a space that's really inviting, that's really welcoming for all people to see our place in this larger movement. It's not us against them, them against us. It's all of us together with each other. And that is a much more inspiring narrative than the one that we're fed almost constantly by so many corners of our society.
Very well said. How can people... First I want to say something that we talked a little bit about my grandmother's hands. And there's a part of that book that I just want to bring up here to see how it resonates for you, where Resmaa Menakem is talking about the fact that he has all these credentials and PhDs and working with clients and MSW and da-da-da-da. And so there are all these reasons that you could come to Resmaa, and that's not why people come to him.
Mm-hmm.
And that he says, people come to me because I have a nervous system that is a calm and welcoming place.
That's right.
For them to come and be with. That's how their lives change. It's not because of my credentials. It's not because I know better than you. It's not because I can tell you what to do. It's because of my fundamental way of being creates the opportunity for change. And I think that that's kind of what we're speaking to here, is how can we as white guys do that work within ourselves to create that out there.
I love that. Yeah. And I think one of the critiques of the movement for equality and justice is that it's elitist, that it's focusing on critical race theory, which is this sort of graduate level understanding of structural racism, which has been distorted.
And a boogeyman, and an easy boogeyman to...
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's been totally distorted for political purposes. But there's a point in saying that, critical theory in general is more of a graduate level way of understanding the world. Academic. And what you're pointing to, it's academic. So it's by nature, it's exclusionary to some extent. What you're pointing to is that we don't have to achieve these great credentials. We don't have to get a PhD or write a book or be the best at anything in order to cultivate that grounded nervous system that is the absolute heart and core of this work and showing up meaningfully in the work for a more equitable world, that it's available to each of us. And that by investing some time and some energy in cultivating that capacity in ourselves, wherever we are, we too have access to everything we need to engage meaningfully in this work. Everything else is, quite frankly, often a distraction and at best icing on the cake.
Often a distraction and at best icing on the cake. Are you open to me giving you an outline for your book based on a 55-minute conversation?
Bring it on, boysen.
Part 1, saying yes. Part 2, getting in touch with your self-narrative. Part 3, building self-worth within a support system. Part 4, honing your skillfulness. part 5, bringing your whole self to your relations.
Nice. Yeah, sign me up.
That's what you just said.
Well, I appreciate you reflecting that back. And, it's 5 parts. It's not 100 parts. It's not rocket science. It can sometimes feel that way, and we get to be in the complexity of this work together. But it's really just basic humanity that we're talking about here. And so, yeah, maybe someday there'll be a book. I'm not in a rush on that. But what I will say is you don't need a book to figure this out. You just need community. You need relationships. And that's what I'm really committed to helping to create in organizations and in the world.
How should people find you?
You can find me at wholeheartedmasculine.org, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and get in touch.
Thank you. I've been with Dan Mahle today talking about equity and manhood and development. And I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Paul Newell, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, we've got to give special thanks to our back-end team, producer, editor, and audio ninja for the show, Michael J. Russer, and Don Huff, who takes care of our graphics and promotions and pretty much makes us look pretty. So, of course, thank you, Don. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener. Because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. What it means for Paul, what it means for Boyson, that is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.